Actually, I'm going to. Hello, audience. This is Sabat Ashraf, I Faqir, here again with what we are starting to now formally call a series that is titled 3.5 Plus. The reason we are laying this out is that Pakistan, as we know, is has formally has four provinces and a couple of other federal units that are not formally provinces, but now we've gotten to the point where it's cleaned up, and th- the two remaining, federal units, actually three, behave like provinces for the most part, especially Gilgit-Baltistan and what we call Azad Jammu Kashmir. And of course, there is the Federal Capital Territory. So there's four plus federating units, and why we talk about 3.5 plus we'll come back to in a second, but first I want to introduce my guest today, Mr. Aslam Kakar, and I think we can call you Mr. for just a little while longer, uh, till you get your PhD, and that is part of Aslam's introduction. He is a PhD. I think the top headline would be you're a PhD candidate with Rutgers, right?
Yes, about
At
to finish. Yeah.
and quite a bit more. So I'm going to let Aslam lay that out just a little bit, and then we'll come back to our uh, topic of the day, and that is very strongly related to why we are calling this series 3.5 plus. So, Aslam, Aslam Khana, how are you doing?
I am good. Thank you, Sabah. Thank you for inviting me.
And you're taking a little bit of spring break time, so this is a good time to catch you and insert ourselves into your holiday plans. So you are give us a little bit more about you. You are a PhD candidate at Rutgers, and that's how we connected. We have common friends that live in that area. Actually, not even academically, but as Dr. Adil Najam once put it to someone uh, at a conference, is that in South Asia back then we counted a billion people. Now we are at least at a billion and a half or billion, almost 2 billion. Let's face it, but for 2 billion people, we are a very small place. The moment you start engaging on certain topics and issues, and in certain circles, you start to find common connections. And so, Aslam
Mhm.
and I, you can count us as being from a different generation or half a generation apart.
Hmm.
And now we keep ending up, running into each other in these circles. So, Aslam, what have you been doing with yourself?
Great question. First of all, thank you for inviting me. And I am, as you said, a PhD candidate at Rutgers University. I My PhD is in global affairs, but which is there is a lot to study, look at in the broader affairs field, but I focus on social movements in Pakistan and Turkey. I study the Pashtuns and the Kurds in the past 100 years. I'm from Quetta. Actually, I was born in a village an hour away from Quetta, and I spent most of my life in the village for 20 years, and then I moved to Quetta City, and from there to Lahore for my undergrad. And 10 years ago, I came to the US. So now
So, so undergrad at LUMS, GCU, where?
GCU, yeah,
GCU,
government
which is
college.
the government college, the oddly named government college university.
Yes, which most people in the subcontinent. I mean, I meet Indian friends, and they either their grandfather went to government college or something.
Exactly.
There are a lot of those connections too.
Yeah. So the reason it's called that is for it has a very pedigreed history as government college, and now has been given a charter as university. So, and they kept the
Exactly.
name, which is it's a cute combination, government college university. So from there you moved to, I believe, the west coast and then the east coast of the United States, right?
Yeah, from when I was studying at government college, I got a scholarship for 5 6 months. I came to the U.S. Studied. It was a non-degree, one-semester academic program in. So I was in Nebraska. Uh,
Okay.
got to experience some of the Midwest, and then I went back, completed my undergrad. I came back with Fulbright.
With
for
the
my
full.
master's. Yeah, I was based at the University of San Diego. So I got my master's there. I then started applying for jobs and PhD programs, and then I got into Rutgers. So I started my PhD.
So you're so basically the other thing as our, and I know you have a smile on it when I say that, but that's the thing, right? In the elite, you say I'm a Fulbright scholar who is now a PhD candidate at Rutgers.
You
But
know,
we can come back to that.
yeah,
so you,
oh,
so
yeah,
you are actually, and if I may do this, because we want to touch these issues, you're a Pakhtun from Balochistan, so to speak.
yes, Pakhtun from Balochistan or Pashtun from Balochistan, as we say it in Balochistan. So Sheen.
Oh, okay. That is actually something. And of course, we have, in Urdu, we say Pathan, but increasingly we have switched over to the more, I believe the word is autochthonous or self identification of Pakhtun or Pashtun.
Yeah,
And you are a Kakar, which to some of our audience will have meaning. We've had famous people with that last name and that clan identity. Of course, the
yeah,
obvious one is the a former chief of army staff in Pakistan. The less obvious one, which we found more interesting, is that the famous playwright or screen writer and comedian out of India called Qadar Khan was also a Kakar.
yeah,
In
yeah.
fact, a Kabul-born Kakar.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Uh, so that brings us to the issues of the day, right? The reason I think I was telling you offline, I like to call this series uh, 3.5 plus is also to say that what has been happening recently in Pakistani politics is this whole tumult around Imran Khan and the falling out he has had, as everyone who the establishment in Pakistan has supported ends up falling out with them.
Hmm.
And that has been happening repeatedly. And because of what's happening right now, more of actually the way we put it is that the Pakistani elite or the dominant class comes from the northern Punjab. For our Indian audiences, that is the GT Road corridor going through northern Punjab, which includes the large cities and the recruiting grounds of the Pakistan Army. And because of that, there is a certain dominance and a certain privilege to that. But with Imran Khan and his falling out with the establishment and making a lot of noise about that and raising the issues suddenly of human rights and establishment, elite capture rather, suddenly that half a province in Pakistan is also suddenly waking up to the realities and vagaries of elite capture. To which a lot of us, and I formulated in that way, is welcome to the party, 3.5 plus of our provinces of Pakistan or federating units of Pakistan have been aware of this problem of of elite capture, and now it's good. I like to think of it and want to think of it positively that it's a good thing that finally the last part of Pakistan as we know it today is waking up to that reality.
Hmm.
And that is how, and I think we see it both that way. I'd like to get your input on that. And most immediately, audience, viewers, uh, Aslam had written an op ed for the Friday Times, a major Pakistani newspaper, now a weekly newspaper, that is titled Roots of Rage. Why is Pashtun anger justified? And now I suddenly noticed, sorry for not being sensitive enough to notice that it was spelled Pashtun in your headline. And I think we should give credit to the Friday Times to making sure they spelled it the way you wanted it spelled or the way you see it, right? Because it's as an editor, it's often interesting to try to make sure that writer's voice comes through and not trying to. I mean, style guides are important, quality is important, but you want the writer's voice to also appear. And so I think I have talked enough. So now that we've introduced you, we've introduced the lay of the land. Let's get into this topic. And there is an anger in Pakistan. There's an anger amongst the youth, and Pakistan is famously majority a young country. There is an anger amongst the Pashtun and other minorities and groups in Pakistan. There has been an anger. I myself am from Karachi, where we have what we self identify as Muhajirs. Other folks want to call us Urdu speaking or this or that. Muhajirs are not all Urdu speaking. And there has been that role of a party, and I have been raising that the different entities, and that way come to some understanding, maybe have history inform what we are doing. So how do you see this? Why are the Pashtuns angry?
Okay. I lost you a little bit at the end.
Yeah, I think the signal went in and out. I was basically laying the same thing out, that there is a lot of anger in Pakistan,
Hmm.
especially amongst, actually now even southern Punjab. I mean, minorities, right? Pakistan even tried being a unitary state at one point, which never ends well, right? Especially for a country as big and diverse as Pakistan. And then the Pashtuns have the situation of not belonging to only one country. We have next door a country that is majority Pashtun, and then there is other complications. Balochistan, which to an outsider, it takes its name from its largest ethnic group, the Baloch, who also span out into Iran and to some extent, I guess, Afghanistan. But the Pashtuns of Pakistan have always sat uncomfortably in that federation. And now you are coming to us and telling us there is actually, you're using words like anger and rage. So tell us about that. Lay that out for us, and then we will come to current affairs.
Sure. Thank you so much. This is a great question. So, as a student, born and raised in Balochistan, and then I went to Lahore. I spent 6 years in Lahore, where my ideas about Pakistan and politics changed because of my experiences with friends and in conversations and just seeing a very different world, like, in Lahore, Islamabad, Pindi. And I came to realize that this is very different from where I lived in Balochistan. So, for instance, growing up in the village for 20 years, I had not seen a library. I didn't know how it looks like. I'd read about it in the school textbook, but I didn't know how it looks like. Like, what is a library? What actually is inside the library? And then when I went to Lahore, I saw like it's a very different world. Big libraries, bigger than Quetta Airport, later I realized. And so those, I think my exposure to the inequalities in the same country kind of made me realize that something is wrong. And then in conversations with friends for like 5, 6 years in Punjab, we we had these conversations that something is wrong. This country is not equal. People living in this country are not equal. They're not living equal lives. And sometimes during those conversations they become heated, and like our tone, my tone, my friend's tone, it would become emotional and angry, and they never found our anger justified. And then that continued for years and years. And then I came to the States, and here I used to hear the same conversations about black people, like, oh, they are angry, they are violent, they are aggressive. Look at this, up to the BLM. So I've been then thinking about like the value of anger. What is anger? How do we define anger? What is the function of anger? And you know, and many, many other emotions. And I also looked into it like from a psychological point of view, like all these emotions exist because they have a reason. They function. Guilt, fear, shame, all these have function. So anger in the same sense is an emotion which has a role to play, and it has a function in not only in our collective political lives but in our individual lives, right? Sometimes we get angry. I mean, and we can go on and on. I have had these conversations with Avnish and other friends, like, it has to be laid out and understood and not just rejected as something aggressive and violent. So I think I was coming at it, the question of anger, from my experiences and from these conversations. And so I wanted to understand, what is it that we need to, how, like, why do people find anger unjustified? Especially the anger of those people who have been oppressed. For example, in Pakistan, I mean, the Baloch, the religious minorities, Pashtuns, Mahajars, Urdu-speaking population, and Gilgit, people in Gilgit, and women, right?
Women,
So
right?
exactly. So then there is this other thing, every time, you, like, for example, the way Ali was, PTM and the PTM leadership in
Ali
India,
Wazir.
Ali Wazir, exactly. Especially the case of Ali Wazir. I mean, it also came from, so this was very timely. When I wrote this piece, this was the time when Ali was released after 26 months in prison. Why?
Yes.
Because Ali was accused of, like, using a very strong and angry language. I mean, I think it also became like a politics of ego. Bajwa was asking for his apology, and he was like, I'm not doing this because, and so I was like really thinking about all these things, and Ali comes out, and I'm like, why did this man spend 26 months in prison? For what? Right?
Yes.
And so I think, I guess this was, just setting the context for why, I thought about this piece. And yeah, so I think, I don't know if I answered the question, but
Yes,
that
you did. And I would like to step in and provide some context for, listeners, viewers who might not know that. Ali Wazir is actually an elected member of parliament in Pakistan, of the federal parliament. And he was associated for most of his career before he got into parliament with a movement called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is a movement for the protection or security of Pashtuns. And this movement has been inspiring, it has been interesting, it has been cool to follow. And I know, people outside Pakistan, particularly, and outside the Pashtun movement, people on the left often like to idolize Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, for example, Basha Khan, as, sort of the example of Pashtun and maybe even Muslim nonviolence and all of that. Uh, but here we have the PTM, a movement coming out of the Pashtun belt that actually is not founded or connected with Basha Khan's movement. I mean, Basha Khan's, the one organization left behind him, or the two, are the Awami National Party and the Khudai Khidmatgar, both in India and Pakistan separately. But the PTM did not come out of that. It came out of another organic, and one has to say, very peaceful, almost pacifist Pashtun movement, and not even ethnic nationalists. It was more about, which a lot of us that think about ethnic issues, we like to think that we are not just being nationalist in a toxic, negative, angry way. What we are doing is looking out for a community. Like the BLM movement, or on a good day, the original Mohajir movement out of Karachi, or the women's movement. You mentioned that the anger that comes up, it's become an annual event now. On Women's Day, there are marches around Pakistan. They call the Aurat March, or Women's March. And one of the things that comes out of that are these very interesting, funny, angry signs, right? These visuals that come out that have these funny quotations, and Pakistani humor is legendary. So we have this thing happening, but the PTM is not it's not a violent movement. It is actually a very self-consciously non-violent movement. And it's not, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not angry nationalist. It's a movement looking out for a certain minority. And watching that, I'd reached out to you, Aslam, and said that I see parallels. I see parallels between the PTM and the early days of the MQM. And I have been trying to have that conversation, and this gives us an opportunity to jump into that. And one thing I really like about this op-ed, we'll put a link on in the description for Facebook and YouTube, and put it in the thread for Twitter, because we are now, we are simulcasting this on Facebook, Yahoo, and Twitter at the iFaqir properties. But you've done an interesting job of starting out with the anger, connecting it with in the op-ed we are discussing, and then starting with a concept that, especially in the US, is now very commonly discussed, and that is tone policing. Right? When someone gets passionate or angry about something, one way to shut them up is tone policing. And when people are doing that, they're often not even conscious that they are doing this, that they are dismissing someone's voice, they are suppressing a voice. But they will say, why are you acting like this? Only if you were less angry or sounded less angry, you might get a better hearing, which flies in the face of all logic, right? With the Women's March, every year I have to say this to people. People keep saying, why are these women so angry? Why do they do these things? Why do they put up what they see as offensive signs? And my point is always, you don't listen to women or any of these groups until they sound angry or they raise the temperature, so to speak. So to me, that's one very basic level of what anger does, or at least expressed anger, right? And the PTM, the Aurat March in Pakistan, are two examples of non-violent movements who are channeling the anger into positive ways. But I went off on a bit of a background and what might sound like a rant. But the point is that at one point, a couple of people from that movement got into parliament, and that movement self-consciously is not a political party. It actually says, correct me if I'm wrong, Aslam, it says these guys are in parliament as independent members of parliament.
Yes.
And two people, Ali Wazir and Hossein Dawar.
Yes.
And they are on their own, but they reflect the aspirations. And for people from outside Pakistan, let us also reiterate that these guys are from a region that for most of Pakistan's history was known as the federally administered tribal areas, which was a bunch of these units, South Waziristan, North Waziristan, and Kurram, one other one, right? There was one. Oh, that might be it. But basically, there was a region that under treaties going back to the British Empire were administered semi-independently, but when Pakistan formed, they were taken in as part of the federation, but not administered as formally part of a province. And that is the plus in our 3.5 plus. It was one of those things, but of late has been included into what is sometimes known as mainland Pakistan. It is now part of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, a province that now has a name that is less problematic. And they are from that region. They are independent MNAs. And at some speech in Karachi, my city, Ali Wazir had expressed anger towards the military establishment specifically. And for that, he was brought up on a sedition case, I believe, and held in prison for 26 plus months. And what Aslam was referring to was that at one point, the then Chief of Army Staff, our immediate previous, General Bajwa, actually said that if he apologizes, I will let him go, which tells you something about the dynamics of Pakistan. This is the head of the military saying, basically expressing that Ali Wazir is in jail because we want him to be in jail, not for any legal reason. He was held for 26 plus months. And basically, they said if he apologizes to the military, we'll let him go. And Ali Wazir flat out refused. He let it happen. And then funny things happened along the way. Ali Wazir was brought into, because there's also the law in Pakistan, as in other places, that if a member of parliament is in jail, the speaker can demand them to be produced or brought to parliament for parliamentary sessions, which again we saw was only done when it was convenient to the establishment. And at that point, we go beyond the military. When the current government needed a vote in parliament to first remove Imran Khan and then for parliament to express confidence in the new leader, basically making Shehbaz Sharif prime minister, Ali Wazir was brought to parliament. Otherwise, he was not brought even to parliament. But eventually, in sort of the semi legal system that we have in Pakistan, is the best I can describe it. He was freed not too long ago, which is what, as Aslam said, triggered this op ed. So you discussed tone policing in your article, and then you went into some of the theoretical framework of anger, right? From philosophy to, I'm actually scrolling through your article too, from philosophy generally to feminist writer thinkers, and a couple of specific other philosophers. We'll put links, as I said. Could you say a couple of words about that part of it, about a little more about the philosophical uh, aspect of view of rage and its role in philosophy and politics?
Sure, sure. Thank you again for the providing the background. It is very important that you set the context for the conversation. I really liked, as I mentioned at the beginning, that my dissertation compares the Pashtun social movements and the Kurdish social movements. So you said something consciously nonviolent movement, which is very interesting. The PTM. Yes, so it is consciously nonviolent movement because there is a legacy of nonviolence in the Pashtun struggle.
Amongst Pashtuns, right? And
Right.
Basha Khan is not the only form it takes.
Exactly. And so that was very interesting. And I would like to know more about the parallels. Hopefully, you can tell me about that, the parallels between the early days of MQM and PTM. So I would really like to know that. Maybe in this conversation or some other day. You said I would come to your question, but first, of course, you were very kind and you said it's not an angry. I mean, it is PTM is an angry movement, but I think here is the thing that I want to the point that I want to drive home is that anger. I think PTM is an angry movement. It is an angry and but non-violent movement, and this is the point that we need to understand is that it is okay to be angry. It is justified to be angry. Even though my temperament as a person, I'm not an angry person. Like most of the time, I'm very calm. And,
We know
uh,
that.
yeah. And I know, I also understand that anger is not an ideal emotion.
Right.
In interpersonal conversations, in interpersonal conflict, and in larger social, collective political conflicts. It's not an ideal thing. But I think the problem that people don't understand is that why would you expect an ideal emotion in a non ideal society, as the Black feminist philosopher puts? Like expecting, for example, Black people to be calm and okay is very unfair. In fact, the problem is the question that I would put is that why are these people who are saying Black people are angry or Pashtuns are angry or Baloch are angry? The question that I have is like, why are you not angry? The problem is not that why people are angry. The problem is that why certain people are not angry. And the same thing goes about, Aurat March, women, and it's like, as you said, I think anger plays a very important role in initiating uh, you know, action in like without anger I think people like you don't feel bothered, you have to feel a certain way to take a certain action. And so for me, why I turn to philosophers, as I also write in the op-ed, is not because they have the propriety of the truth, but it's because I think they have studied this question or problem of anger, for longer periods and have systematic articulation. So, from Aristotle to, as I also point out, from to the current day, it has been studied widely, and it's beyond the scope of this one article. And I was reading a book, The Case for Rage, which I mentioned in the article, which is where a lot of my theoretical insights come from, by Mahisha Cherry. She's a Black feminist philosopher, writer. And so, she really lays it out so well, like this types of anger and, the rogue rage, the white rage, and um, the sentiment and narcissistic, and then the Lordian rage, which is based on Audre Lorde, who was a Black feminist poet and essayist writer. She, like, she wrote an essay called The Uses of Anger, in which she justifies what anger means, and why is it important, and so I think I hope I'm answering the question. The point that we can, go into
Right. No, and
details.
folks can read the article where you work your way very systematically through what philosophers say, separating out the different kinds of anger, as we say, rogue anger, wipe anger, resentment anger, narcissistic rage, and then what you call Lordian rage. In
Right.
common terms in the US, we talk about righteous anger because we often have that discussion in American political circles of a resolve not to lose your righteous anger, but to channel it and use it properly, which then we get into what you describe or report back from Cherry to us about transformative anger, right? How
Right.
does anger help transform and channel stuff, right?
Yes.
And of course, in African Americans and civil rights movements in the US, there is that moment in, I believe, the 60s where I'm sick of tired of being sick and tired, right? There's
Hmm.
a moment where an African American leader said that, and it
That's
was
right.
related to the Democratic Party's movements in the 60s and one of their conventions. And then you get to what the PTM is. And if I may jump in there, you were asking about perils. What I see is that there are certain minorities and minority organizations often at this point. For example, even before the PTM came up, I would see parallels between how the Muhajir movement evolved out of Karachi, because I am from a family and traditions where very early in Pakistan's history there was this youth movement, more or less, or a movement where calls itself the Karachi Suba Tehreek. I don't know how familiar you are with that. That wanted Karachi to be separate, and my father would tell us that when we would bring that up about providing some sort of infrastructure or systemic solution to what was becoming a contentious situation around Karachi and its demographics, he would say if we went to our elders, because my father was a young man at that point, and brought it up, our elders would say, no, this is blasphemy. He would say that in Urdu, that this is, we didn't make Pakistan because we wanted to be this or that. The usual arguments given against and used to suppress this kind of movement. And so that movement went away. Then in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, a new movement came up amongst young people. Now tell me if this sounds familiar, right? Young people standing up for certain outrages, moving along, and then the establishment, that whole arc of first they dismiss you, then they make fun of you, then you fight them and then actually then they fight you, and in these situations often you get co-op. And then there's the usual mechanisms of co-option, right? Either they kill you, they try to buy you, they
Mm.
make sure you leave the country, or uh, they co-opt you by making deals, which is what happened in Karachi. And then there were specific incidents, right, where the state came down hard on Karachi, and there was a going back and forth between times when they came down hard and when they tried to co-opt. Happily, the PTM, I don't think anyone has tried to co-opt yet. At least the state hasn't. There must be other forces, right? And the parallel I would see, and this is interesting because when we were talking about Muhajir rights and issues in the 80s, we would hear parallels about a movement down in what we call Hyderabad Dakkan, the Indian Hyderabad, southern India, where the Majlis Ittihad al-Muslimin, which was their sort of Muslim, ethnic slash religious faith community. It wasn't a religious organization, it was an organization representing them. And some of the things they had done in terms of minority politics in what was then Andhra Pradesh sounded a lot like what was happening with the MQM in Karachi. And both of them actually went the political route. So there were those parallels of, playing minority politics, trying to get, resources and a place at the political table, right?
Mm.
But then there were specific incidents that sounded, what sounded like, a movement getting a boost from some very violent incident. It was an explosion at a mosque in Hyderabad later, and in Karachi we had various ethnic. And initially it was turned into, and I will say this, it was turned into a Muhajir Pashtun issue, right? So there was these violent, which is why it is difficult to talk across these lines, because there's bad blood there,
Sure.
especially with related to Karachi, because that initially was turned into a Muhajir Pashtun issue, which, by the way, is again parallels, right? What we are seeing in Lahore right now, and some people are saying that it took a lot of effort on the part of the government and or the state right now to prevent what is happening in Zaman Park today turning into a Punjabi Pashtun issue, right? It
Mhm.
seemed like there were some people within the PTI movement, or PTI, and its movement, who were trying to make it into a look. This is a Pashtun leader, and Pashtuns are getting a bad shake, and yada yada yada. Which is, when you look at the form of it, is very similar to what the Muhajirs say in Karachi, or the Muslims out of Hyderabad say, and they're trying to build a national movement now.
Mhm.
So all of these things, those are the parallels I was talking about. And when
Okay.
the PTM came up, again, you saw that arc of it came up. First, they would dismiss them, they would make fun of them. Then they would, try to create a narrative and badmouth them and all of that. In fact, in the MQM's case, it got so bad, the MQM itself, because of conditions in Karachi, at least how I see it, started out under a very repressive regime. There was no democracy to be part of. So they went up against the state and always had a thread going through them that was militant. And I mean actually militant, as in they were a militia, they had a militia. And the argument given there is that it was the only way to survive. And that is why I also talk about the self consciously non-violent. And when we say non-violent, there's a difference between non-violence and pacifism, right?
Sure.
Which, mainly a lot of it highlighted by things Dr. King said, where, at one point Dr. King says, I'm not a doctrinaire pacifist, right?
Yes.
Non-violence, in Dr. King tells us, was a conscious decision on his part. That when you are dealing with this big an enemy, the only way to move forward is to be non-violent. And there you see a parallel, as you have also drawn, between the civil rights and African American rights movement in the US and the PTM, because the PTM is also chosen and very consciously is non-violent. And just for completeness, I'd like to mention the last leader of the PTM, which is Manzoor Pashtun. Our audience needs to know these names, and part of the reason for doing this conversation, especially doing it in English, is to fill out some blanks and details for people. So we now have the PTM movement led by, again, an iconic leader, now mainly in the form of Manzoor Pashtun. And again, his, I don't know, is that actually his family name, or is that a nom de guerre? The Pashtun in his name.
It says so. I think it comes from the way Pashto is spoken, or certain words are pronounced
Yeah.
in the tribal areas. So, like they say, I think instead of Pashtun, Pashtin. It's the
Right.
way they. Yes.
No, right.
No,
But what I'm asking is that actually his given name, or is that a title, as
I think
revolutionary
it's
leaders often take on titles?
yeah, it's a title.
It is a title, right? So there is that leader. So that, and I know I'm talking a lot when we're supposed to be listening to you, Aslam, but there's a lot to fill in here, especially for audiences that we want to reach in English, right?
Yes.
So that now brings us to the last part of your op-ed, where you say that the PTM is, you actually title it intriguingly as saying towards a more political rage. Are you saying it is not yet completely in that form, or
To, towards a more just. That's what I think.
righteous? To
Yeah.
use the American word righteous.
To be more inclusive. So I'll come to.
Okay.
Yeah. Was that the question?
Yeah, no, but explain that. I mean, why are you saying towards?
So I'll say that. First, I want to. I agree with a lot of the things that you said, and you know, one of the questions that came up while I was writing this with conversations with friends was like, well, what about? Are you saying anger well, the Taliban are also, they can also say we're angry. You know, like
Mhm.
anger. How do we separate, anger that is justified from anger that is not justified? What about the anger that Trumpsters, for example, they have? So, which is a very valid question, right? Whose anger is righteous anger and whose anger is not righteous?
Right.
Sherry actually finds she gives four dimensions. So that's how she identifies. The criteria for differentiating between transformative anger and destructive anger is that there are four things that she outlines. One is, what is the aim of the anger or the rage? And I lay this out in the article, right? Define aim, what is aim? What is the tendency, action tendency, or motivation? What kind of perspective informs the anger? And who is the target of the anger, right? And so I think if we use this criteria to really define and explain anger, then it makes it easier for us to, identify or differentiate anger that is justified from the one that is not justified. And so I wanted to talk about that, and I also agree with what you said. How I think when you talked about the parallels, I could see not just between then the Mahajir and Pashtun, but I think pretty much in a lot of movements, struggles. So the classic state response to movements, especially in non-democracies and authoritarian states, is that first they ignore. That's like the first kind of response they do. It's like, okay,
Ignore, dismiss. Right.
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
But when that doesn't really, address the problem, then they try to reform or appease. Reform. The danger with reforms is that, let's say, in the PTM's case, if the military, acquiesced its demands of, 4 or 5 demands, then the danger in reforming is that that can embolden the movement further. So there is also that calculation that comes into play. It's like, okay, what if we reform, give them the kinds of changes that they're asking for, then it could turn it into a much stronger and bolder movement. And when that doesn't work, then states repress. And that's what happened in the Pashtun case. And I think those parallels perhaps make sense, right? And then some with repression, which is like, then, I mean, one day we can hopefully talk about my research, which is on this question of like, why do some movements become what I call armed? I don't use violent and non-violent, and I have reasons for that, because I think violence and non-violence, these binaries are like, very much, if we say this group is non-violent, is like there is somehow, it's somehow innate to this group. They are peaceful innately, naturally. And if a group uses arms, even could be justified as to why they're using an armed resistance, engaging in armed resistance. Um, so I think it like with the Pashtuns, for example, one of the problems in the conversations from Orientalist scholarship to this day is that these are aggressive people, they're violent people. I'm also, one of the things that I'm trying to do is that in my research is that, look, I use armed resistance. It's because of strategy. It has nothing to do with the nature of the people. The people are pushed to the limits. They have to come up with with a strategy that they think makes much more sense. So, and one last point here that you talked about, when we talk about violence, there are like two kinds of approaches: philosophical and instrumental. So philosophical, like Gandhi's approach was philosophical, right? It's what we can say in the German philosophers' terms, in Kantian terms, categorical imperative. That non-violence, to engage in non-violence is a categorically right thing to do, not because it is convenient or not because it is, effective. It's because, turning the other cheek is the philosophical position. PTM, I don't know from I think it is more instrumental rather than philosophical, although Hathans, I mean, it depends on individual members then. But I think as a movement, the way I see it is that some of it is inspired by course, Ghaffar Khan's philosophical approach, that it is the right thing to do, regardless of its convenience or effectiveness. There is that comes in the calculation, right? Like if you start an armed resistance. I mean, in Pakistan's case, it can be. I mean, those like cost benefit analysis, that does come into play. But I also just wanted to like talk about this now. Towards, why do I say towards? I say towards more just ages, because I think PTM in Pashtun society, I think the way it started and the kinds of issues that it has tackled and challenged the military, I think, it's admirable. But I still think that it needs to be more inclusive of women, for example. Like, there need to be more women, not just in the protests, but in the leadership positions, because they have to be given space where they can talk about, not just like it's different when women. You can see that like one of the biggest pro-Kurdish party, which is HDP, the Kurdish Democratic Party, they have women leaders from the top to the lowest rungs of organization. So there is at the top the chairman and chairwomen, and that goes down to like the very down, yeah, which was fascinating, and we see the same in Syria, in the Syrian Kurdish organization. So I think there is a lot to learn from, not that it is an ideal kind of, I mean, there are still problems. I spoke to women, of course, but it is in a it's relatively compared to other movements. I think there is so much to learn from them. So and there are also Sikhs and Hindus and, Ahmadi and Shia Pashtuns in, the attacks, like even last couple of months ago, there was an attack on the Shia mosque. Like, I think PTM has kind of not really included the,
so in American terms, you're saying the PTM could be more intersectional.
Yeah, I like that. So I do that. Yeah. So intersectionality. I know, like, I was talking to a friend just like before this, before we started this, that you have said so many times, and I agree. Like, I know we I guess there is more that needs to be talked about, but intersectionality, exactly. I say that oppression is intersectional. I think it requires an intersectional approach to address the problem. So I think that is the whole point. Yes, to summarize the towards part.
Wonderful. So yeah, and we're going to have to come back and, like you said, discuss more of what you're laying out in terms your own research, basically with the Kurds and the Pashtuns. And I love this. I call it parallels. This, I guess, wouldn't be called intersectional, but making us think about how these movements are happening, even movements that and that some of them become anathema, right? Especially because when the state and other forces or establishment forces of various forms get to, especially in that dismissive phase, which keeps coming back sometimes, they are able to paint certain movements or even push certain movements to go to places where they become anathema for a lot of the community. I mean, that basically also happened with left movements everywhere, especially in the West. And Pakistan, because it was part of the Western alliances, the word socialism, for example, in the US, even the word socialism had become a bad word till very, very, very recently. I mean, the whole Bernie movement has been interesting because it's rescued that concept a little bit. So, things like the Muhajir movement, the word Muhajir, the MQM, in that case, I think they actually got pushed to doing things that were indefensible in a lot of places. But luckily, the PTM has not gone that way. And again, which I think there's a lot to learn from the PTM as well. It's not a one-way conversation between these movements. And it's wonderful to hear your work where you are, taking from the also looking at the Kurds as a parallel, right? And
Yes.
one thing I will say about the PTM in terms of women is, from what I've heard, they have women, they have a sort of an elders board, sort of a board of these advisors who are not part of the young movement people, but are, politicians and activists, correct me if I'm wrong, who sort of advise them, and they keep talking, like Bushra Gohar comes to mind. I believe I'm getting the name right. And she sort of
Yeah.
lays out where she's in touch with the movement, and they are sort of like like companies have boards of sort of advisory boards, right? So there's an advisory board where there are women, but could you also touch on that? How much of it is cultural? I mean, how much of it is systemic and cultural within? And I hate to sound like an Orientalist, but the culture of Pashtuns as society is structured right now makes it difficult for women to come out and participate at a certain level. Is that too simplified or too Orientalist a view, or is that an excuse? What is it?
That's a great question. I think about this all the time. I think uh, there is so much that needs to be unpacked and under, and
So
understood. Huh.
we're definitely having more conversations on this platform.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. I think um, part of this is that Pashtun society is to this day a very tribal society.
Right.
So I think as we are moving from tribalism, we are moving from, and it's very urban, not urban, rural. A lot of the people in Pashtun communities, I think, live in rural parts of the country. So there is urbanization, urbanization, education, that changes, these um, roles, right? Like,
Right. Social structure.
right, exactly. Social structure, yeah, economic structure. Um, and there is also, patriarchy, which is again, this institution has existed you know, for ages, right? So I think um, I don't think, and it's innate to the people that they like. I can tell you families where they're very different. But
Right. No, and the family aspect happens. I mean, interestingly enough, you even look at South Asia generally,
yes,
it's a very patriarchal society, and yet you have had these female leaders now in every country: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka.
yeah,
Sorry, I got disconnected there. But so there are specific families, and it's often there's a pattern to that. Families that are supportive will help or encourage or find that their female members do want to participate, and then they do. And in Pakistan, in some cases, I'm seeing more of that. I mean, I see young and fascinating activists and people, especially ironically coming out of Balochistan, right?
yeah.
Your own province, right? There's Shahin Taj, there's Hamida Noor, there's people we've run into.
Yeah, there are examples, I think, and it's amazing. Arman Loni, I think that needs to be mentioned. The professor who, throughout his life, worked really, really hard and studied and became a professor of Pashto, lived in a very tribal, came from a very tribal background. His sister, Vranga Loni, like he fought. I mean, there were a couple of articles written about him, the way he resisted all kinds of pressures, from the family, from the tribe, from the people around. But, it is also, in a way, it is seen as a threat to the status quo, right? But the man resisted everything, and his sister is a well known face now in Pashtun society, Blangar Noor. So I think there needs to be more of that, and I think what I mean by to to be more inclusive of PTM is to, like, because it seems to me that the face of the movement is men. I mean, there are, it's So like Ranga and other women. I think that the space that needs to be given to women seems to be lacking. And then also being inclusive of like violence that discursive violence, physical violence that religious minorities within Pashtun society face, like speaking for them, including them, because I think that is for me, the Lodian rage needs to be more transformative. It needs to be more inclusive and more. It can be just only if it. I mean, of course, it's I think there is this ideal um, you know response to violence. So it's not an ideal response in the sense that it can be more inclusive. So that, I think it's the aspiration towards that I'm trying to.
Wonderful. So we're actually now also getting into an hour in. So like I said, we're going to have to come back and have this conversation. I'm hoping to keep this series going on platforms. I forgot to say in the beginning, I write and tweet and blog under the handle iFaqir. And I guess you do under Aslam Kakar. So
Yeah.
this conversation will go out on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube under the iFaqir handle, and we will keep this conversation going. Especially, and I see myself as doing these threads because we are pulled in so many directions. That there is the Pakistani aspect, there is the more general activism and other issues. There is our role in the American context, which I'm happy to see you get more involved with as well. So we have to keep doing this. This 3.5 plus series will keep going. And to report back, the first thing I did in this conversation was a conversation with a young Pakhtun friend out of Peshawar, Fawad Pirzada, and I'm constantly pushing him. And there is another activist that is based, I think, now at Namal, and he is a climate slash these emergency stuff is his graduate work. So there's these voices we want to pull together and have these conversations. Hopefully we'll get more people from Karachi, from Lahore, and get this platform or these conversations, more importantly, going. So anything you'd like to leave our viewers with, Aslam? I like that you want to be positive. You want, inclusive, transformative. Those are the two words that are jumping out at me so far.
Yeah, I
Where
think it's. Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the way you moderated. You gave the context to the conversation. Yeah, I think it's clear from the article that we need to be a bit more, I think, critical of our own judgments and just look into these words in terms a bit more deeply and see, where other people are coming from, why are they angry, and also, quite frankly, I mean, really, like, try to understand, try to read, and I guess without reading, it's impossible to appreciate the complexities of the world. It just, I mean, things are in one word, like, for example, violence. There is a conversation about violence. What is violence? How do we define it? What is not violent? What is violent, right? Some scholars say violence means harming a living being. It's when people are angry, they break a window. It's not really a violent act. So I'm not saying that's my definition, but I'm just saying I think we need to be aware of, yeah, we need to be more creative and more insightful, more critical of these terms, even, and who is it coming from? Who is saying what? And so I think, yeah, that, the rest, I'm looking forward to more conversations on this.
Wonderful. You're just a little difficult to pin down. You're doing so much, you're active, and in terms of reading, I guess we will try to have the links both, because I found the archive of op-eds you've done for the Friday Times, and then you have your own website. Hopefully you're compiling all of this on your website and people can.
Yeah, so I am now, there is that website which, like a blog where I've written all kinds of things, not necessarily political. Sometimes it is about my fears,
Your
and
fear.
hope, and all of those things. So those are like really streams of consciousness. Whatever comes to my mind.
That is
And
fine.
yeah, there is that. But now I'm going to publish my academic website where I
Good,
that
good, wonderful.
yeah.
So good.
Um,
I think we're catching you early enough in your evolution that we can follow you on your journey, and we can all benefit from your thought and your. I like how you've evolved into this role of being an academic voice discussing these issues
Thank you
and
so much. That's
providing
very
us with some intellectual heft, because some of the, and also, of course, there is that issue of elite capture. Sometimes I feel, even coming out of Pakistan or South Asia, even our alternative spaces are the victim of elite capture, so to speak. I mean,
that's
it's an
true.
unpleasant thing to say, but it's something we need to guard against.
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, so there is, speaking of that, I founded the Pashtun Studies Network. Now, it might sound very insular and as it
Right?
is, but it comes from my experience in intellectual circles, in amongst the intelligentsia, South Asia, Pakistan, where Pashtuns have gone through, just like other oppressed groups in the country, have gone through so much. But there is, like, they don't have a channel, like a TV channel. They are being talked about, but they don't have their own newspaper, right? In academia, Pashtuns don't have a space. So this Pashtun Studies Network was a step towards that, creating space in the academy where
Give us a quick thumbnail of what that is. That's a series of lectures. What is it?
no, so it is. I so two things. One, there is a website which I can send you later. I mean, it's being developed. On the website, I'm hoping to, along with other friends, hoping to, um, collect and organize and publish all the literature on music, history, politics, culture, women, all of these things on Pashtuns. So people who work, regardless of who they are, right? They work, those who work on Pashtuns. So my goal is to collect data, literature in the past, let's say 100 years, and keep that in a form so that people can access. That's one.
Okay.
Second is that I have an email group where of the Pashtun Studies Network. There are about 40, 45 people. I mean, Pashtuns, non-Pashtuns, those who are interested in the issues. And so that is a way for me to provide a platform to these scholars, intellectuals, people who work on the Pashtun question, Pashtun, any aspect of the Pashtun society. So it's like really sharing scholarship. I mean, disseminating ideas. Like, let's say if you write something, I share it on that. So 40 people comes in, like, okay, this, that. So, but the point is to create a space, and hopefully in the future, again, this is a very lofty goal, to even start a journal. Like, these are, I think one of the things is that we are lacking is that it's not just the Pashtun society, but the Pakistani society, that we don't read and we don't write.
We don't
It's
study. Anyway, so I have to call it here. It's a little over an hour. And for our audience, we'll try to put a link in there, but that's Pashtun with a U, PashtunStudiesNetwork.org. I believe I was just Googling that. And there's a
yeah.
couple of typos on the website I want to talk to you about later.
Yeah, there are.
Um, so
Urdu
we
is
will
one, I need to fix that. And
the
there's
Urdu, and then the bibliography page, actually, the URL has a typo.
okay.
But if you're following links, that's fine. Anyway, so that is, all of this is wonderful to happen, and I think we should get offline now, because it's been an hour, and we will, I guess, have to try to. I will have to keep chasing you around and making sure we have these
No,
moments.
you know,
And talking. No, I'm not blaming you. It is understandable. You have a busy schedule. You're still establishing things, you're getting pulled in so many different directions, right? There is your PhD, there is work on this, there's a Pashtun Studies Network, there is a social circle, and I have a little bit of visibility onto that. You're part of this. One thing that is left with me is one of the early British, when the British Empire was reaching out into Pashtun areas, and they were building the railroad and all. Famously, a British engineer had described the Pashtuns as these wild and woolly gentlemen, which sort of so much about the Pashtuns, right? From outside, they look wild and woolly, yet they are gentlemen. I mean, he's still emphasizing the fact that there is a code to it. But we can talk about all of that another time. Thank you for taking the time. And I know we got a little delayed getting on the air, and we're still a small network, but we'll pass the video for this around, see what kind of feedback we get, and we'll keep doing this. And of course, whenever you feel like you have something to say, please reach out and we will do this again.
Thank you so much. I will keep in touch.
Thank you for your time, Tashakkur. And we will take it from here, audience. Again, this is iFaqir, Sabahat Ashraf, reaching out to you on this platform, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. Just at iFaqir is the way to find us. And I think, Aslam, you are at Aslam Kakar, or there's a number on it?
Aslam K. Kakar.
Aslam K. Kakar. We're going to have to discuss what the K stands for at some point, but that's okay. Okay. And so with that, folks, this is iFaqir signing off, and we are going to end the broadcast here, and we will be back soon with more of these provocative, hopefully, discussions. Tashakkur, fi amanillah, take care, vaya con Dios.
Thank you. You too.